All right, let's get started. So welcome everyone. My name is Robin Mickelson, and I'm going to be taking you through a little bit of a journey today. We're going to cover a couple things for those of you who may need to brush up or are fairly new to AWP, or just have lots of questions about, God darn it, how do these acronyms, these work packages all integrate with each other, and how do they affect each other? Some of the most seasoned professionals and practitioners in AWP still ask questions and struggle around some of those package integrations. So we're going to hopefully try and make that a little simpler for you here today. We're going to conduct this more like an educational type presentation. It is what we do. As president of the AWP University, I'm responsible for assessing and implementing new curriculum for our students. We're up to about 75 different modules now, and really moving forward. So I invite you to please go look at the AWP University Learning Management System online, awpu.com. It's pretty simple. That's AWP letter U.com. Give it a look. And at the end, we'll have a free offer that we're going to have for you also. But as I mentioned, we're going to conduct this like a classroom scenario, to have some discussion and bring it up. So we are going to use Slido here. This is different than the main conference Slido. We at the university we have our own license for the purposes of training and quizzes and examinations and stuff like that through some of our live presentations. So what I have for you here is I'm sure you've all from the main conference used these before. Scan the QR code to get in, and we're going to go through some basic quiz questions that we're going to use more for discussion purposes as we go through our time here today. Also in that, any questions that you have, just flip over to the Q&A section and ask any questions as we go through. Being that through this webinar platform, we don't really get the ability to interact. And the way I like to teach, I like to have a conversation. I like to interact with the students to move forward. The best way we can do that on this platform is for you to interact through typing the questions into Slido. We have two distinct sections here today that we're going to go through, we're going to touch on. The first one is we're going to go through some process bases to identify kind of the order and how work packages tie together. And then we're going to take a lot more of an analytical look, and we're going to look at work packages from each of the packages as the center of the universe, if you will, and everything that affects it, so that we can give you that better web of understanding of how the packages integrate with each other. So again, we're going to use Slido, and we're going to kick off with a practice. Those of you that are with us, if you could answer the first question on your app, which is how much experience have you had with AWP implementation? Go ahead and give us some input, and we'll see AWP what. Well, that's good. You're in the right place, because we're going to help to bring you up to speed on some of the real basics of the work packages, as well as maybe some of the more advanced things. We're also going to talk about the SWP, the System Work Package, which is a relatively new acronym in our alphabet soup that's been brought forward by RT364. So we're going to kind of cover that in accordance with some other work packages and how they kind of work together. All right, so let's get started, and we're going to jump into it. So it looks like we've got a good cross section, a little bit of everything from It's My Life to some very experienced and a few that are not that familiar with it, but we're going to cover that for all here as we move forward. So let's jump in. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the outline, as we call it, the PACs. This is an AWP Process Overview. It's a chart that we know and love in the industry for a long time. Some of you have probably seen it. This has been created many years ago by very smart people, and has been utilized in multiple different sources. I believe the IP of this particular chart's even been donated to CII. But we're going to cover it here today with a few little nuances and changes, one of those being the system work package in the bottom corner. But let's discuss what these packages, what the packages are, where they interact, how they affect each other. And then, like I said, in section 2, we're going to take a little bit more analytical approach to how they interact together. But let's cover the first thing. So when we start talking about everything that we need to identify in AWP and what we're going to plan and how we're going to break up a model, how we're going to break up everything that we need to do to execute a specific construction execution program, one of the very first things we need to identify is systems. Obviously, we need to identify, engineering is going to work long and hard to get those P&IDs and those systems identified. What that's going to give us is it's going to give us an identification of clear groupings of how we're going to move towards turnover. This isn't necessarily an identification of the turnover packages as of yet, but this is an identification of the systems and the P&IDs that's going to give us an idea of the different areas, the different items that we're going to be building. It also gives us a basis for estimate as well, if you will. It's the starting point. Now, as we move forward, we're going to take that basic system information along with some other information such as plot plans and other data to do some of our first pass work, if you will. Once we've got some basic P&IDs, we've got some basic things in place. Even when we first start identifying our construction work areas, those CWAs, it might be before a lot of systems have been fully identified. But the CWAs, as we're going to develop those, they are geographical areas that have been plotted out on the plot plan itself. Sometimes these sessions, when we identify the construction work areas, are literally a whiteboard with markers to identify what units and what area or we're starting in and which direction we're heading. These CWAs, they are non-discipline specific, so they're all disciplines within a geographical area that makes sense to group together. So it's a geographical area, not necessarily an entire unit. Sometimes it could be a process train within a unit, depending on how it's scoped. So construction work areas, geographical, non-discipline specific areas. So those CWAs, they start as basically a geographical grouping. We're going to draw boxes on a diagram to identify those. And as they mature, we're going to start to schedule and move forward. But one of the things that we use those construction work areas for is then starting to scope our construction work packages. Now, what is a construction work package? A construction work package is a discipline-specific package that breaks down the CWAs into further smaller pieces. CWPs or construction work packages do not cross boundaries of contracting. So when we're thinking about our contract quilts and how we're going to contract and execute a program, we're very much thinking about construction work packages as well. So as we break down those construction work areas to identify the construction work packages that are now discipline specific, we're going to think about contracting boundaries and guidelines and how that contracting quilt is going to work. But furthermore to that, what we're going to be doing at that point is those construction work packages are going to be very paramount. They are going to tie on a one-to-one relationship to the level 3 schedule nodes. So when I say a level 3 schedule node, well, just to clarify for the general terms of what we mean in as far as a schedule and schedule levels, a level 1 is really the entire project, start, finish on the entire project. Level 2 schedule is the CWAs that we just talked about moments ago. So those construction work areas, which one's first and what the basic duration in each one of those construction work areas are. When we get to construction work packages, that is now our level 3 schedule. That is the activity base of the activity level on most construction schedules, sorry. And those construction work packages tie on a one-to-one to those activity level 3 activities. The level 3 activity should carry the nomenclature of the construction work package or vice versa, so that there's a clear designation and tie of the one-to-one relationship between those. But further to that, those construction work packages, what are they, right? Those CWPs, they are a breaking down further of those construction work areas into a much smaller scope. And as I said, that's tied to that level 3 schedule activity. So once we've kind of looked at those and we've had the influence of the basis of our systems organized, the construction work areas that have been now penned and identified from them and starting to mature, we've broken down those construction work areas into construction work packages. Now, what's the next thing we need to consider? Most people would have thought we'd have gone to IWP, but no. What we're going to do is we're going to start to flesh out, we're going to start to schedule, we're going to start the effect of other deliverables, such as engineering deliverables or EWPs, on those construction work packages. Because those construction work packages link at a one-to-one with a level 3 schedule, obviously we have to understand all of the constraints that tie to those construction work packages. One of those is obviously the engineering deliverables, being vendor data, the engineering deliverables by right being the drawings and P&IDs and such, those technical drawings. Other outside requirements of that data all flows into those engineering deliverables and those EWPs, if you will. EWPs are typically not considered a physical package as much as they are a grouping of data, and how that grouping of data ties and is affected by the scope of a construction work package and vice versa. So the scope of an EWP should be as close as we can make it to the scope of a CWP or the engineering deliverables for it. They're never a one-to-one, just simply because of the multiple different uses for individual drawings, such as ISOs that are used by multiple different trades for multiple different purposes outside of just the obvious piping trades, such as the pipe fitters. But those engineering deliverables or EWPs have to be back and forth tied to those construction work packages and what the effects of those deliverables from engineering are going to be on the construction work packages and when we will have that information to be able to execute. Now, of course, we're still not going to an IWP yet because we're still considering our constraints against those work packages. And one of those ways that we're still considering those constraints is procurement deliverables, our materials. The PWP, that basis of the deliverables for procurement and all of the materials that are required to facilitate that construction work package or a portion of, tied again and as close to a one-to-one, but they are typically tied to the EWP on a one-to-one, not necessarily the construction work package, due to it's more of a web for obvious reasons of multi-use drawings, as we've talked about before. But those procurement deliverables tied to those construction work packages and mapped to those construction work packages, those groupings of data deliverables, again, not a physical work package per se, as much as a grouping of data that needs to be tied as a constraint. Obviously, it's a requirement. We do not send packages. The basis of AWP, we don't send packages to the field unless they can be completed. They are constraint free and can be completed. The first level of constraint analysis of materials against the CWP and how that affects our scheduling for that CWP. So you see the CWP starts becoming the real center of the universe, if you will, when it comes to all the things that interact and affect that construction work package and when it can be executed, and affecting that construction schedule through inheritance of what those constraints are against both engineering and procurement deliverables. Those procurement work packages will show material requirements. They'll show different effects on the construction work packages and our key deliverables and information ties to identify those the CWP constraints. Now, we're still not going to the IWP. Now we're going to start considering our turnover, right? So if you think about this, we've got a construction work package. It's a basic scope of things that need to be executed. Ties on a one-to-one or a many-to-one to a construction contract, meaning you could have many CWPs that make up one contract, or one CWP that makes up a contract, but they never cross contracting boundaries in a CWP. So with that all taken into account, we also need to now consider our turnover packages. How are we going to turn over this particular project to the owner? It's extremely important to understand that, they have certain systems that they want commissioned first. There is an order to it. There is an order to how they want them turned over for startup. So when we start looking at it all, we've got how we need to turn it over. We've got what we're turning over basically in the systems, and the turn packages gives us what parts of those systems need to be turned over when. We've got our basic construction schedule from our construction work areas, and that level 2 construction work area that's affecting the CWP. We need to operate within that. We've got our engineering deliverables that based on their deliverable dates, affect the schedule for the CWP. We've also got the procurement requirements that affect the schedule for that level 3 schedule activity that's tied directly to the CWP. So now we've got the CWP that's been heavily constrained and analyzed from multiple different locations. The schedule should make a lot more sense. The level 3 activity node has got a lot more credence behind it. The CWP, the contents, the components, and the digital data associated with it are starting to get more fleshed out. Now we move to the installation work package. But further to that, we also, in accordance with that, will start working with the system work packages that we're going to talk about next. And if you look down in the bottom, you'll see the arrows going to and coming from, as well as the arrows coming from systems into the system work package. Now, the system work package is a fairly new package, and we'll talk about it here soon. It comes from RT364, which concluded, I believe it was last year, on their research, and delivered a great paper. And we'll talk about that more on what those system work packages are and how they affect the installation work package. But for scoping of the installation work packages, those installation work packages are subsets of the parent construction work package, never crossing the boundary. So an IWP only has, or the grouping of IWPs only have the one CWP as a parent. So an IWP will never have multiple CWAs or multiple CWPs as predecessors to the installation work package. They will only have one CWP and one CWA associated with them because they don't cross those boundaries. Those installation work packages are scoped as the executable portions of work. So when we say executable portions, what we're talking about is this is where the rubber hits the road. An IWP or installation work package is the package that's issued to the field. It becomes a physical package in the back pocket of the tradespeople on site. It's what dictates the work. It has the information in it as to what's being executed, and the scheduling, constraint analysis, and release plan for those IWPs is how we run the actual execution of construction on our sites. So what's the size of those work packages? Well, here's the thing. For a long time in the industry, an IWP was sized. You know, we said in the original 272 literature that an IWP in essence was 500 to 1,000 hours worth of work, which is not wrong, but that is a go by. It's not a rule. And IWPs can be sized in many different ways. One example I'd like to give is if you're in an underground program and you're installing risers from a underground header for drains, you're only going to get opportunities to install the risers and tie the risers to the headers in certain intervals. Usually you're going to tie that program to a foundation program, and you're going to come up from the header with the riser when the foundation is being dug and the forms are in place and being worked on. So in essence, you're only going to get access at a certain narrow window to install the risers for that. And thus, you're only going to do one at a time. You're not going to be able to knock off multiples at a time. You might get 2 or 3, depending on how big the area is or the foundation that you're tying these drains to. But the truth of the matter is that they will be very small packages. You could have a 40 or 50 hour IWP for isolated work such as that. On the flip side of that, look at it from the point of view of an iron worker or a crew of iron workers that are stick building a pipe rack and fabricating and forming and raising bents. So all the cross bracing and the bents and such for a pipe rack. Very repetitive action. A lot of the piece marks are the same. A lot of the drawings are the same. It's repetitive, and often we will issue much larger packages for that. We might end up with 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 hour packages. It's very rare to be that size, but there is reason to be that size. So we don't always follow that 500 to 1,000 hours. So what we like to say in AWP is that a IWP is scoped and sized based on a single crew for a set duration of time that can be executed from start to finish without stop. So when you consider all those things, and let's break it down, a single crew, that's very key. That means not only is it discipline specific, but it's also broken down by trade. So within that discipline. So for instance, the pipe fitter versus the person that might be doing the coating for that particular piping, or the testing, or any of the other things that follow on activities such as installation and others. So an installation work package is for a single crew, not multiple crews. You're not going to trade, and you're not going to have a single IWP that, say, 2 piping crews or 2 groups of pipe fitters are going to work on. They're not meant to be handed off. The only time that you ever typically would hand off an IWP between multiple crews is day shift, night shift. You may have some IWP sharing between day and night shift, but an IWP is intended for a single crew for a set duration of time. Now, a set duration of time is often guided by the basis of being able to complete it from start to finish without stop. So therefore, it's much smaller groupings of work based on being able to send a crew in to start the tasks and complete the tasks. So when considering all those three, that's going to size your IWPs. Now, bringing it back into how it's affected by the rest of the packages. Of course, all the other packages that we're talking about affecting the CWP execution dates, the schedule nodes, those level 3 activities directly tied to that IWP. And as we said, an IWP does not cross the boundaries of its parent CWP. It is also executed within the start and finish dates of the schedule node associated with the CWP. So therefore, as a subset, there might be multiple IWPs that make up a single IWP, and we will execute and track at that level. Of course, below the IWP level, there is further planning, such as short interval production control that's executed by the general foreman as far as their day-to-day and their daily work plans. But all that being said, the execution of the IWPs is now heavily affected by system work packages. And system work packages are considered very early on tied to the turnover systems, tied to the systems or to the turnover packages and to the systems themselves. Those system work packages are subsets of how we would want to turn over individual pieces, or multiples of these will create a turnover package itself. System work packages are often sized based on test extents. So say if it's a piping system work package, you might go from flange to flange in a test environment so that you can track that grouping of pipe is ready for testing and others. So there's multiple different drivers behind the system work package scoping. They are subsets of systems themselves. They are affected obviously in their schedule by the turnover packages and when the turnover is supposed to happen. And they are mapped on a many to one, so many IWPs to one system work package, or many portions, I should say, of IWPs, because it's never all of an IWP is within a system work package. Sometimes it is, but generally they can cross those boundaries. But we do a web mapping, meaning that in this system work package, it requires these 10 IWPs completion for it to be completed. Now, there may be other system work package contents within each of those individual IWPs as well, but portions of each of those IWPs will complete that system work package. That mapping is extremely important and will drive the schedule for the IWPs themselves. And those system work packages are very key in ensuring that we get a timely and effective turnover, that all system components are completed. We're limiting the amount of punching that's required, because now punch listing has gone back to what it's originally intended for. And what is punch listing originally intended for? Capturing deficiencies in the actual construction, not catching unfinished items. All items are supposed to be finished, and a punch list is supposed to be just deficiencies. We've kind of moved away from that over the years to where it's all things incomplete and deficiencies. System work packages and the use and the management of them help to drive the prioritization of those installation work packages, or IWPs, to ensure that we get system completions in a timely manner, and we get full compliance for turnover. Now, what do we get from that also? What we get from that, tied into our turnover schedule, tied into our systems, and tied into our IWPs, is we tend to now heavily affect that magic transition from area-based construction to system-based execution. And what that is, that's that 70% or so completion, where we've often scrambled to remap the project, to now moving from area-based construction of doing everything in a single spot, to now spottily finishing things to hopefully complete a system. Proper use of SWPs helps to limit that impact. And actually tomorrow I'm speaking as part of a panel group where we will be tackling systems turnover and talking further about the system work packages as well in that group tomorrow afternoon. So please tune in for that one also if you want to learn more about the system work package. But for this and the interaction that it has with the other packages, know that it is highly used to set prioritization for scheduling of many of these others, and for identifying IWP work and installation work package priority, if you will. All right, so that basically takes us through the essence of the very basic or basic level of IWP systems, the IWP processes, the AWP process diagram as a whole, all of the different influences, showing some of the relationships with the new system work packages, and how all of these work packages need to be considered and tied together to be at least constraints for other items, as well as information sets for to be pulled from to create the scope of other packages. So that's the basic process flow. So what we'll do is we will actually look at a couple of quiz questions. What we like to do at the AWP University, whenever we're producing one of our programs or teaching one of them live, we are completely online and recorded versions and delivery online with our systems. We like to ensure that after each module, we do a bit of a quiz and a knowledge check. So we're going to do that here today. Not that we're going to put you on the spot, but we're going to use this more as discussion points. So this is a lot of things that we just covered. So back into our Slido that you started to work on before, we're going to answer a couple questions here, and we're going to go through them kind of one by one. So first question, based on that quick lesson that we just covered, construction work packages are. So what is a construction work package? So let's go down the list and take a look. So break construction work areas into smaller packages. That's viable. Broken down to develop the scope of IWPs. So we do break down construction work packages to identify the scope of IWPs. Starting to see a trend here of A and B being correct. Geographical area-based packages that are discipline specific. So yes, that's true also. So geographical, so meaning that they are geographical area-based, just like the CWA, but now they're discipline specific. So often when we break down a CWA into CWPs, we'll start immediately with the different disciplines, and then we'll look at the quantity of work for each of those disciplines within the CWA, and then identify how many CWPs we need to break that discipline specific scope into it. And that's often how simple we often schedule or identify our requirement or number of construction work packages per CWA. So geographical area-based packages, definitely. One or more, but never part of, identify the scope of a contract. So as I said before, so they could be one to one on a contract, or it could be 2 or 3 CWPs per contract, but never part of a CWP. So I think what we've got to is our answer is definitely all the above. So good job on that. The all the above, break down construction work areas into smaller packages, obviously very true for those of you that selected that, but the most correct answer is all of them, all the above. All right, good job. So let's look at the next one. So procurement deliverables are, so the procurement work package, what is it? What are those procurement deliverables? Attributed to align with each CWP. Yes, that is true. Provided to construction so that they can develop their work plans. Align to deliver materials to the job site in a right amount at the right time. Develop to enable procurement to most efficiently procure needed material. Starting to identify a theme here. So attributed to align with each CWP, we definitely want our PWP groupings to align as best we can to our CWPs. We're going to create that web and map it. Provide it to construction so they can develop their work plan. Those PWPs, complete with schedule and components, will be constraints that we will identify in execution to develop the individual work plans and when we're going to execute which IWP. Align to deliver materials and develop to enable procurement. So we're definitely seeing a theme here of all the above. Okay, good job, guys. So let's go to the next one. What are installation work packages? Just to make sure that we've covered and that people have grasped it. So installation work packages, are they reminders to construction of how to complete a CWP? I don't think so. If they're a reminder, I think we've missed the boat with our scoping of installation work packages, possibly. They're delivered constraint-free to crews and execute start to finish without delay. That's a definite. So we don't send them to the field unless they're constraint-free. They're executed start to finish. Remember the definition of an IWP. The definition of an IWP is, quite frankly, a scope of work for a single crew that can be completed from start to finish without stop or delay. So that definitely fits. Started based on the master schedule. A master schedule will affect based on the CWP that's apparent to the IWP when they are actually executed. However, the IWP is not typically listed in a master project schedule. If it is listed as a subset to a CWP or a roll-up task to a CWP. Typically not scheduled in Logic, though. We use the industry-leading AWP automation tools for that. There's many of them out there. Many of them are represented in the vendor pools here today in this conference. So they don't typically start based on the master schedule, being that the start time is not in the master schedule for that, but it's apparent to the CWP is. So they're affected by it, but not governed by it, if you will. Can range from a few days to a few months. Typically not a few months, definitely a few days. So let's look at what we've got. Delivered constraint-free to crews and executed start to finish without delay. That is truly the correct answer. The others are not correct statements for the IWP. All right, so excellent. Good job, all of you. So let's look. So we've got a couple questions, and let's break for this question and answer it. So what about design work packages? So now when we're talking about design work packages, I'm going to assume that we're referring to boundaries that have been identified for such things as piping designers or structural engineers, those types of things. So at the engineering level. So when we talk about design work packages, as far as in engineering as to, what designer is doing what grouping of work goes to an individual for engineering development, those would typically be rolled up and tied to the EWP deliverable, which is then obviously mated to its one or many CWPs and the web of influence to that CWP. Design work packages are not typically construction forward facing. At least in my experience, they typically fall into a basis of management of the actual engineering itself. Engineering's vessel for yelling beyond its walls, if you will, is typically the EWP, which will also contain the vendor package information within those EWPs, which is, like I say, typically not a physical package. It's a grouping of data with certain constraints associated with it. So I hope that kind of answers that question. Maybe I missed the intent to design work package, but from my years in the engineering office back when we'd considered a design work area, that was what the designers each were working on. All right, so let's jump next into the packs. Take a quick drink. All right, now, what is this next lesson, the packs? So when we start talking about the packs, what we're going to refer to here is work package types and relationships in here. So this is where I promised we were going to start to look at these diagrams from the CWPs and all the other packages being the center of the universe, if you will. So we're going to start with drawings like this, which is as we go through each of the packages, we're going to look at a drawing like this from the package that we're considering as the center of the universe. So from a CWP point of view, what are all the effects? What are all the packages tied to it? And what are the inputs and outputs to it? So from the CWP, obviously predecessor CWP work and successor CWP work are heavily influences on the CWP. The CWA is the parent to the CWP, so multiple CWPs will make up the entirety of a CWA. CWPs don't cross boundaries of CWAs. So the CWA is the parent of many CWPs to that CWA. EWPs, the influence, the drawing registers, the requisite drawings, the information from engineering ties to that CWP for the purposes of scheduling, obviously, and completeness of the engineering data contained within the CWP. The PWP being the procurement work package or procurement grouping of data tied to the requirements for the CWP, used for constraint analysis, constraint management, identifying when materials are available, what materials are required. Without diverging too far, these PWP ties to CWPs is often where we also do the translation between as designed and as ordered, which is a very important aspect between the PWP and the CWP. And what I mean by that is often material engineers will substitute or go up a spec, if you will, for the purposes of material requisition or ease of requisition. So it may not be exactly as what was scoped by the original engineering, but absolutely is sufficient for the construction. So that you may have differences in materials between a PWP and a CWP. That mapping needs to occur so that we understand not just as engineered, but as procured, and what the materials are to satisfy the constraints of that CWP. The IWPs obviously are a child to the CWP, meaning they're subset of the IWP. An IWP never crosses the boundaries from one CWP to another. They are fully contained within the single CWP that the IWPs come from. Could be 2, 3, 15 IWPs to CWP based on the scope. But obviously the CWP is the parent to our installation work packages, and thus then installation work packages are discipline specific based on the CWP parent. Then of course we've got that tie to the system work package. Now system work packages are on typically to one CWP, so there's multiple SWPs that'll be tied to a CWP, and those CWPs are used for prioritization CWPs for completion of portions of the systems for turnover packages, if you will. So the CWP influences and breakdown of those CWPs is important for those turnover systems. All right, so that's the basis of the CWP. Let's jump to the next one, that EWP that we were talking about, that engineering work package, or like I was saying, it's not typically a physical work package. So let's look at it as it's the grouping of engineering data and deliverables to satisfy the CWP. So CWP boundaries define the scope or requested scope of the EWP. Those EWPs are never one-to-one. As much as we'd like them to be, there's a mapping and a web, if you will, of logic tie between the EWP and the CWP. But for the most part, they're largely one-to-one. EWP deliverables roll into the CWP, so the EWP will contain the information to satisfy the completion of that CWP. And thus, back to the last slide, you can see how that CWP then influences multiple others. Interfacing work scopes, we don't say necessarily predecessor or successor work scopes because it's more interfacing work scope of EWPs and what is tied directly, what the interfaces are to those EWPs, such as connect points, continuations. those types of things tied to it. External engineering from an interfacing work scope. So what we're talking about external engineering here is vendor data. Vendor data is definitely external engineering and is as important as the main engineering data, and often needs to be watched that much closer. We've all been in a project where the issuance of vendor data has caused possible delay. Better management, better visibility of that external engineering, being vendor data is one of them, tied to the EWP, will give us much more efficient constraint managed scheduling through that. And then of course the PWP tying to that EWP for material requisition and also scheduling of that item. And the different POs tied to those PWPs to support the EWP. And from the engineering deliverable point of view, of course, within that grouping of data, we're talking about drawing, specification, engineering analysis, material requisitions, vendor data, as we talked about from the engineering, external engineering, and construction requirements, turnover requirements within that EWP. Okay, from that EWP, there's also a straight line tied to the turnover packages and what packages, what the turnover grouping is tied to that EWP. So these are typically a many to one for each EWP, and often a turnover package will cross boundaries of an EWP because depending on the system's extent. So there again, that's a bit of a mapping or a web of logic ties between the turnover packages and the engineering. That's not a small thing. That is a requirement to identify the constraint relationship between those, because obviously engineering delivery of information to the field for execution will heavily affect our ability to turn it over. So we need to ensure that we have that mapping and understand the implications of delay or inaccurate scheduling to those turnover systems. All right, so that's the basis of the EWP. We're going to now go look at the PWP. And there again, we look at that as kind of a grouping of data. That's a data set from the material engineering group, from the procurement group, that brings forward all of the items required for the EWP to be executed and thus the CWP. So the CWP affects and aligns with the EWP. That EWP is what's going to drive the PWP. So the CWP doesn't directly affect the PWP itself or the procurement data. It obviously is affected by the EWP, and thus the tie is through the EWP to the CWP as far as a constraint against that and the POs tied to it. Material responsibility matrix tied between those as far as what materials are required when by who, tied to the EWP and the PWP in this manner. Additional PWPs for that EWP, often it's not just one procurement work package or procurement data set that's tied to a single EWP, so there may be others required in there. And then of course, from those, the material mappings to the SWPs to identify from that procurement, that scheduled data set, what materials are tied to what SWPs so that we can understand that as a constraint. All right, so from that basis, then we get into looking at the turnover package. So a turnover package, in essence, we need to look at this from the point of view of all the IWPs. So we're going to look at this from execution or completion of the turnover package, which is here. So CWP 1, 2, and so on, tied to the IWPs. The IWPs are broken down from those CWPs. The IWPs are tied to the SWP, and the SWPs roll up to the turnover system. So this is showing the linear relationship to actual completion for that turnover package. So multiple SWPs could be from multiple sources would make that turnover package. So there again, it's a web of data assignment tied to these aspects of and the execution of them. Okay, let's look at the turnover package from a little bit different position. So the CWA, the EWP, the PWP, and the CWP in that interaction in that basis, identifying the scope of the turnover package. So this is early scoping. This is execution. So during execution, this is the flow of information. During identification and scoping, this is going to be our flow of information. So what turnover package affects what? So our turnover and sequence plan. What SWPs affect and are tied to that turnover package. And then all of the different CWA breakdowns to CWP, as well as their affected EWPs and PWPs, loading into that turnover package as part of our initial scoping. So again, showing you the different relationship basis. And I know these are tougher concepts I'm going through pretty quick, but I know all of these presentations are going to be shared, and thus you can review it, as well as at the end, I've got a free offer that you can actually go and review a lot of this information for free, external through the AWP University. So let's look at where the rubber hits the road, the IWP. That's our last package that we're going to cover here today, and the interactions. The IWP, it is what we're doing it all for, if you will. That installation work package, that is the tool of the tradesperson for execution. So everything we do ties to it in one form or another. Everything needs to be scoped, and everything needs to be constrained analyzed to identify whether an IWP is executable. Predecessor and successor IWPs obviously affect the execution of that IWP. And when we say predecessor and successor, we're not necessarily talking about schedule logic ties as much as what we're talking about is physical ties. Think about this more from gravity than CPM schedule. And what I mean by gravity is if you need to install a spool at elevation before you can attach the next spool at the 10-foot level, obviously gravity dictates there's a predecessor IWP and a successor IWP. Obviously, we're going to build to support from the ground up type scenarios. So predecessor and successor IWPs, that's more from an execution requirement, if you will. Obviously, the schedule comes into play, but when we're scheduling those IWPs, we're scheduling them thinking about gravity and constructability more than we are logic ties, and creating the schedule for the IWP execution based on when the other items need to be done and when they have been executed. All right, then we got EWPs and PWPs that are tied to that. Why do we have those two? One is for, this is the drawing scope for the IWP. So the technical drawings that are required for an IWP come from the EWP. So this is direct constraint management. And then of course, PWP from the scheduling of procurement deliverables, that material scope of the IWP referenced against the PWPs to give you a scheduled delivery of materials, which is a constraint obviously for scheduling and release. IWPs are never issued to the field unless they're constraint cleared. Predecessor, successor, information for the drawings, engineering information, material availability, and then of course our SWPs that those IWPs are tied to. So those system work packages, what IWPs need to be completed to satisfy the scheduling of that SWP to facilitate turnover and the completion of the turnover package. I know that's a mouthful, but all these things in the circle need to be considered to appropriately schedule the IWP for execution, work with the craft for execution of that IWP, and then obviously issuance for the craft so that they can start working on their short interval production controls, their daily work plans, if you will, for the contents of that week or so's worth of work. All right, so IWP, that's the physical package. These suckers are actually printed or sent on a tablet out to the field. They are the pivotal point of execution. Everything before that's paper shuffle to satisfy the actual execution, which is where the cost is, right? The actual construction. And the IWP, it being issued to the field, has all of these influences that need to be considered. All right, so we're about right on schedule here. So we're gonna cover a couple more quiz questions as we do at the university. Every lesson accompanied by a couple of questions to make sure you're paying attention. We're gonna take a look at another couple of questions, and then we're gonna open it up to some more Q&A if there's any more questions. So let's look at it from the point of view of a CWP. So a CWP will align one-to-one with what? Okay, IWPs on a one-to-one? No, multiple IWPs will make up a CWP, so that's not correct. Align with an EWP on a one-to-one. We'd like them to align with an EWP on a one-to-one, but typically there's a web of interface between EWPs and CWPs when you start considering the multiple use of drawings such as plot plans, isometrics, erection drawings that are used across discipline. You won't have specific one-to-one mappings, but you can get pretty close, but they won't align one-to-one. Typical level 3 schedule activities on a one-to-one, that is for sure. Typical level 3 schedule activity is tied directly to a CWP, and I would hope that the nomenclature of the CWP is actually represented in that level 3 schedule note. So that's definitely a correct answer. Turnover packages on a one-to-one, definitely not a turnover package on a one-to-one to a CWP. So obviously that gives us the answer of one-to-one on the level 3 schedule. Good job. And align with an EWP on a one-to-one, that's not a bad answer. That is a goal. It just unfortunately doesn't realistically happen due to the web of interface and the multiple uses of different drawings across multiple CWPs. So you're going to have influence of EWP across multiple CWPs, just thinking about the different drawings. But that is a good answer because that is a goal. We just will never get 100% one-to-one there, but we try. All right. Completion of what packages is used to identify completion of the turnover packages? Okay, is it the CWP? Well, it wouldn't be a CWP for the completion of a turnover package because a turnover package typically follows system boundaries or portions of system boundaries. And therefore, as we put together a turnover package, a CWP is a geographical reference, and there might be multiple CWPs required to identify the completion of a turnover package, and it's typically not identifying completion of a turnover package. Certain bits and pieces of CWPs need to be completed to complete those turnover packages, but that's not typically our type. The SWP or the system work packages, they are subsets of turnover packages. They are tied to execution of IWPs for the prerequisite and the timing of execution of the IWPs. They are also tied to the CWPs as to when they execute, so that is a viable answer. Completion of the turnover packages is tied to the EWPs? No, the EWPs are issued well in advance of the completion of the turnover packages because that's pre-execution of construction turnover packages as post-execution for turnover. So EWP is affected, but it's not the thing we would use for identifying it. CWAs, again, that's too high a level of package. So when it gets down to it, you're all getting it. That's exactly it. It's the SWPs. Those SWPs, several of them, 2, 3, 4 of them, depending on the scope of that particular system, will make up the turnover packages. They don't typically cross boundaries because the system work package is system specific. So 3, 4 SWPs will make up a turnover package. When all of those are completed, that turnover package is ready for execution or ready for turnover, sorry. So SWPs, right answer. Good job. All right. So what packages must be scoped in order to properly scope and sequence IWPs? So great question. So CWPs, they need to be scoped. They need to be scheduled. They need all the above in order to properly execute our SWPs. Yes, we need SWPs to set priority. We need SWPs to identify our execution strategies. So SWPs definitely need to be scoped first. EWPs, yeah, we need those engineering drawings. Those deliverables need to be tracked. They need to be constraint free, meaning that the EWP has been delivered to satisfy the CWPs, and thus the CWPs broken up into IWPs has been done, and you're tracking those as a constraint, so they need to be scoped. CWAs, we don't get CWPs or others or EWPs without CWAs. So I think we're getting somewhere with that. The obvious is all the above. We need all of those scoped, and CWPs is not a bad answer, but you need to look at the other ones also because CWAs need to be scoped before you scope the CWP, so you can't scope one before the other, but they all have a hand to play in the execution and scoping and proper sequencing of the IWPs. So CWP is not entirely wrong answer, but the more right answer is all of them. All right, so good job all. So keep the questions coming. We only have a couple questions here, but let's take a look at them. So the one thing I did fail to mention also, just like you've seen within the conference portal, you can go in and vote for questions as we move forward. So let's take a look at these two questions. So first one, how would long cable pulls that span multiple CWAs get categorized into a single CWA? That is an excellent question. There is a man that's speaking at this conference. His name is Ben Swan. He's going to be speaking on buildable work packages. If he hasn't already, I'm not sure of the schedule, unfortunately. But anyways, when it comes to cable pulls and CWAs, often what we will do is there will be specific CWAs identified for E&I. So we may have like underground duct banks, for instance, would be an independent CWA unto itself. Rack pull cable runs might fall into a CWA unto itself. So where we'll have a CWA that will fall into more of a discipline specific basis. But the reason why we do that is because it's a bit of an outlier, because we obviously can't cut a cable pull. Cable pull doesn't get cut along package boundaries. It needs to be completely within a single package, because you pull a cable from point A to point B, you don't stop at one point and wait for something else. So it needs to be completed within a CWA. So often, depending on the scope of a project, we will make specific CWAs to grab large cable pulls. There will be, in essence, discipline-specific CWAs for a lot of engineering aspects of E&I, because you have to, in order to grab some of those cable pulls. Often we will put instrumentation and meters in separate CWAs that will align more with the CWPs and such, the more standard CWAs, where we'll also have special CWAs that'll incorporate such things as the underground duct banks, above ground cable pulls and cable tray, those types of things. So hopefully I didn't confuse that too much, but it's a very good question. And when we start talking about cable pulls that would span typically more CWAs, we will encompass that into an E&I cable CWA, if you will, or however you choose to nomenclature or call it. All right, so you identified the need for support for smart PNIDs. How does AWP deliverable change with dumb PNIDs, or is it the same with less ability for automation? Well, I think you answered your own question in there. It is definitely the same with less ability for automation. When we start talking about smart PNIDs, it gives us opportunity for managing our data groupings. You know, as I was looking at and talking about EWPs, and we were talking about PWPs, we were talking about more a web of data tie and data management. We called them data groupings rather than physical packages. So when you start to consider that, when you start looking at smart PNIDs, that system information makes it much easier to automate if we've got those smart PNIDs. It's not a requirement. We've been doing these same methodologies. I mean, we did a lot of these methodologies with pen and paper to start with 20 years ago, when we first started penning the AWP and workplace planning models. So smart PNIDs are a godsend moving forward, but not absolutely necessary. When we're talking about dumb PNIDs, we're talking about just drawings that basically have your extent markups and system identifications and specs and standards. We'll still use them the same way. It's just obviously a little bit more of a manual process and manual activity. So let's look at that. So hopefully that answers that question. If it doesn't, please follow up and type in your question. Last question that we've got up here. Should PWPs cross the boundaries of EWPs? If not, how can you gain the cost savings of larger requisition quantities? Very good question, and often they will. Especially when we're talking about bulks. Certain things like you know, when you talk about the most common valve on just about every project, 6-inch carbon steel, that's a standard valve across multiple projects. You're going to do bulk orders, but that PO for that order will be called out across multiple PWPs or one PWP towards multiple EWPs. So that's where we start getting into, where I keep giving the caveat of a web of tie, where we'd love to get one-to-one, but one is not possible, and it's more of a web tie, and we need to understand the web of logic tie and how that data affects. So we'll never get to one-to-one, but that's kind of a goal to try and make it as simple, but the logic tie of what data ties to which is most important. So that's a very good exception that creates that data web rather than a one-to-one relationship. Is obviously larger cost savings and requisitions bulk buys, we're going to have that effect. And then that schedule activity for those bulks will tie to it. Where it gets more complicated is where we've got bulk buys with multiple delivery times. For instance, if we've got a PO that's saying that there's going to be 3 different deliveries, sometimes the allotment of bulks, just like anything else in material management, can be difficult. All right, so we got one more question in here. We're into overtime for 1 minute, so I understand if you've got to leave, and I appreciate that you've been here. Is this planning system built into specific software or just built out of WBS to reflect the structure? So there are multiple software vendors, whether it's DCW, it's Hexagon, it's Aviva, iConstruct. I suggest looking into all of those. Look at the vendors that are represented here. They've all got great automation systems that tie into these types of things. WBS planning and structure is more of a philosophy for how you set up your WBS than it is an automation system that's going to help you with that, but that does trickle down into all of your other automation systems. So if you're looking for vendors for those types of things, look no further than this conference and the vendors represented here, and give them a call and send them an IM. All right, so from that, I would like to thank you for joining, and if you don't mind, rate the presentation, what you thought, give us a score from 1 to 5 on the presentation. Let me know if I hit the nail on the head, covering the basis of some of these work packages. And as I promised, thank you for some of those great scores, but as I promised, as a free offering, some of the stuff that I just covered here are definitely some of the work package relationships and the initial premise, the process is covered within one of our free courses, AWP Executive Briefing. We've just released it. It's great. Scan that. It'll take you direct to the website. Sign up and start your free course. We obviously have a large library of multiples that are offered, but thank you for coming. And as a reward, scan the QR code. It'll take you to the free course to sign up and start that. It is certificate based for that executive briefing. So I thank you. If you have any further questions, want to get a hold of me, my email's on the bottom there, robin@awpu.com. I look forward to speaking with many of you in the future, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Robin. And now is time for a short break. You can use this to network with the speakers or with other attendees as well. Please be back in the main room for 2:30. Thank you so much, you guys. Have a great day.
Thank you, Brianna. Thank you, everyone. See you.
Bye, guys.